What are you doing? We got some awesome podcast here.
Welcome back to another exciting adventure of Rethinking Revelation. I'm your host, Travis Finley. This is episode 78. We have an interview with Dr. John Fesko. Dr. Fesko is presently the academic dean and professor of systematic and historical theology at Westminster Seminary, California. He has a prolific writing history, anywhere from covering the Westminster Standards to Death in Adam, Life in Christ, Word, Water, and Spirit, Who is Jesus, The Law of Faith, which he's a contributing writer, the Trinity, and the Covenant of Redemption. But the pièce de résistance that we are interested in today is Last Things First, Unlocking Genesis with the Christ of Eschatology. And if you know anything about me, you know that my mouth is watering even now as I just uttered those words. Unlocking Genesis with the Christ of Eschatology. Last things first. I highly recommend you go out and get this book and read it with a discerning eye. It's got a great contribution to the discussion of biblical theology and eschatology and the role of Genesis in all of that. One thing I do want to say about the book is it does a great job in marketing with the cover. Last Things First, the title is printed backwards from right to left, and then it is superimposed upon an image of an egg. So you've got the which came first part, right? Very, very intriguing. As I said, it's a great book, and enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Fesko. Before we get into the interview, though, I want to give a shout-out to a streaming media service that I have come across from a Facebook ad, and I absolutely love it. I have left Audible behind. I have left the Overdrive Public Library streaming service behind. Playster, in its availability and frequency, just blows both services out of the water, Audible and your public library service. Playster provides music, movies, books, and for me, audiobooks. I only use it for audiobooks, so I can't really give you a review on music, movies, and whatnot, but I'd imagine it's pretty impressive. They have different combinations of subscriptions that you can use. You can use everything, get full access, or you can simply choose one, which is what I did. And it's comparable in price to Audible, but the frequency with which you can listen and the availability of particular titles is very, very impressive. So I highly recommend you check out Playster.com. All right, there you go. There's the plug, and here is the interview with Dr. John Fesko.
So what I would like to do is possibly just jump into the fray as much as we can. Why don't, if you wouldn't mind, John, just let our listeners know a little bit about who you are, what you'd rather be doing if you ever had a free moment, and then I'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm the academic dean and professor of systematic and historical theology at Westminster Seminary, California, and I've been there since 2009. Before that, I was an ordained pastor of a small congregation in the greater Atlanta area in Georgia, where I pastored a church for about 11 years. And so I've been, in ordained ministry for close to almost 20 years, and I've been teaching at the seminary full time now for going on 9 years. So things have been going well there. I've got a number of interests theologically, but I think one of those is the integration of systematic and biblical theology. And so that's just kind of a quick thumbnail sketch.
Yeah. So tell me what you think about this analogy. I did this in a Sunday school class once, and I just feel like the people weren't as attuned to what I was trying to communicate. I brought in a fully baked cake, a fully dressed cake that I baked myself. And then I also brought in all of the ingredients, and I set them down on the table, and I said, okay, we are going to talk about two different approaches when we understand the Scriptures. The first one is biblical theology. The second one is systematic theology. And I said, when you look at this cake that's fully dressed, I want you to think biblical theology. When you look at all of the ingredients broken down over here and separated, I want you to think of systematic theology. So that the biblical theology, if we think of Genesis to Revelation, this is what God has given to us. And then systematic theology is our compartmentalization, our categorization. It's a man-made breakdown of what makes the cake. How does that work for you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, although, as it strikes me, I think, maybe I would want to reverse it. It was Gerhardus Voss who said that the biblical theology, or what he called the history of special revelation, that you draw a line, beginning with the alpha point and ends at the omega point. So you draw a line tracing redemptive history from Genesis to Revelation, so that you're taking the disparate parts and tracing out how they unfold historically. But at the systematic theology, you draw a circle, and it's the same line, but what you do is it's what he called, I think, the truth test or the consistency test, where you see how those seemingly disparate parts fit together and cohere into a logical, consistent whole. And that he called the systematic theology the queen of the theological sciences, because ultimately you could take these different parts and maybe they fit together, maybe they don't fit together. If they do fit together, then you determine its truthfulness because you see the consistency therein. I think the way that B.B. Warfield illustrates the same idea is he uses the analogy of the different levels of an army. That if exegesis is perhaps, and I forget the precise nature of the illustration, but individual soldiers, and the biblical theology takes those same soldiers and groups them together into battalions and companies, and then systematic theology takes those battalions and companies and groups them together into armies. That's the way he did. So I don't know. At least as I hear it, I'd have to maybe think about it some more. Maybe I'd want to look at finished cake as the systematic theology, and the different parts or the ingredients as a biblical theology. It's all the same stuff, but on the one hand, you're looking at it individually and separately, whereas on the other hand, you're looking at it together. And I think that, especially with systematic theology, there's often the assumption, I think, that each one of the loci or each one of the individual doctrinal subjects of systematic theology is a unique, disconnected bucket. If you're talking about creation, then that's one bucket. And if you're talking about eschatology, that's another bucket. Or if you're talking about Christology, that's a separate, different bucket, and you keep them all separate. But in reality, really good systematic theology can distinguish, not separate, but can distinguish how those different doctrines appear. But all the while, you're always noting how all of these doctrines have interconnected webs that link one to another, so that when you're talking about Christology, you're not just talking about the person and work of Christ, but that Christology is inherently eschatological. To say that we're talking about Christ at the same time to talk about eschatology. So that's why, if I listen to the analogy, at least initially, I think I'd want to flip it around, but I'd have to give some more thought. So that's just at least my knee-jerk reaction.
Sure. Well, that's the fun thing about analogies, is you can just think about them from different angles, and as you brought up with Warfield, you got so many different options of describing what we're doing as we read the Bible. All right, so let's jump into last things first. What can you tell us about what made you interested in writing this book?
Yeah, I wrote it a number of years ago. Memory serves me correctly. It was published back in 2007, but I wrote it at a time when in my particular denominational context, there was a lot of debate about the so-called length of the days of creation. And I was really unhappy with a lot of the claims that people were making, kind of on all sides of the equation, just because we're coming at the question of the length of the days of creation and looking at the text of Genesis as if that was the most significant issue that really faced the biblical reader. And as I looked at the history of the doctrine and the history of the church's reflection on Genesis, I don't want to say that the church never reflected upon the length of the days. There have been times spread out, whether it's Origen or Augustine, or statements that 16th century theologians have made over the years, and then especially it came to the fore in the 19th century with the advent of Darwinian evolution and questions about the origin of man. But I thought that there were more fundamental questions that were at stake, and in particular, as you look at the New Testament, whenever the New Testament interacts with the opening chapters of Genesis, it never had that question in view. It doesn't ask questions about the length of the days, but rather, say, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is reflecting and looking at connections between Adam and Christ. Now, the same holds true, especially in Romans chapter 5. And there are other texts that we could draw attention to. But, for me, I think what was particularly significant is that Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15:45 and following, calls Christ the last Adam. Or conversely, in Romans chapter 5, verse 12, he says that Adam is a type of the one who was to come, that is Christ. And so that, that Paul had Christ in mind as he's looking at the Old Testament, but in particular at Genesis and the opening narratives there, caused me to go look into the opening chapters of Genesis to say, okay, well, what cues do we get from Scripture itself, Scripture interpreting Scripture, that would give us hints and raise flags as to the way that we're supposed to handle the opening chapters of Genesis. And so, long story short, the end result was the book.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, I was very impressed with your book, and not that I'm anybody special, but I have a master's degree from Reformed Theological Seminary, and I do enjoy scholarship light. I suppose if I had my way about creating my own world, I probably would want to be more of a scholar in terms of trying to discuss things that I see that are important. But all of that to say, I was really, really impressed and appreciated your book on so many levels. And, it's one of those things that had I had it 10 years ago when it came out, who knows how much farther along I would be probably in my thinking by now. But all that to say, I think it's a wonderful addition to the discussion, and I really, really appreciate your approach in the book. So thank you for writing it. And I know you give kudos to the person who gave you the title for the name in the introduction. But last things first is and the egg on the cover. That's just a fantastic mixing of metaphors. Which came first? I think that was fantastic. So tell me about that then. So you gave the explanation for the title. You didn't want to call it You didn't want to call it protology for the reasons you gave, but you chose last things first. But there is the background of the egg. Where did that come from?
That was entirely the publisher. What ends up happening is that you give your material over to the publisher, and they end up with people who work on it from various angles, whether it's editorial or copy fitting it, getting it ready for publication. And they sent me the cover, and I was like, hey, look at that. All right, that looks great. That's terrific. And sometimes publishers will give you a choice, and they'll say, we've got 3 covers. Which one do you like? And so I'll poll family and friends and say, which ones do you think are good? But yeah, so they ended up coming up with the idea, so I have to give the publisher the credit for the cover.
Well, indeed, it was very very provocative, I think. Okay, let's transition into some of the content that we can talk about. You in your introduction, you make a distinction between a literal or a dispensational hermeneutic and a reformed hermeneutic. Can you talk just a bit about that?
Yeah, I think that what a lot of folks don't realize is that in the 19th century, there was a change really in assumptions about the way that you read the Bible. You can find this in some authors like Benjamin Jowett, for example, an English 19th century scholar, or there's another work that I was just recently looking at by a theologian by the name of Alan Mendes, and he wrote a 19th century title called A Critical Study of the New Testament, where they made a case that and also Moses Stewart in the 19th century, American Presbyterian theologian, made the same type of claim in about the 1830s, that you just read the Bible like any other book, and that it wasn't unique in that sense. And if you just read it like any other book, you would discover that it's unlike any other book. But I think that in reading it like any other book, what ends up happening, say, for example, whether it's a novel or whether it's a newspaper, you end up developing kind of a literal reading of the scriptures that, that if there's a rock in there, then it can't be anything else than a rock. If it's a tree, then it's nothing else but a tree. And I think that that's the overall historical context that really shapes, I think, dispensational hermeneutics. It's the idea that you come to the text of Scripture with a very literalistic, it's been described as a wooden understanding of the text of Scripture. So, for example, in the book of Revelation, if you're reading it and it says that there were frogs, well, then that must mean that there will be literal frogs, or that if there is a great dragon, then there must be a literal dragon. But yet, historically, since the Protestant Reformation, theologians, Reformed theologians, especially those that confess their agreement with the Reformed confessions, such as the Westminster Standards or the three forms of unity, have recognized the principle of what's called a good and necessary consequence, and or the Scripture interpreting Scripture, which you can find, for example, statements to that effect in Westminster Confession, Chapter 1. I think it's in paragraph 6. And it's the idea that there are some passages in Scripture that are easy to understand and others that are not so easy to understand. And that the way that you interpret the Scriptures is by following the interpretive method that you find in the Scriptures. How does the Bible itself interpret itself? How do the latter portions of the Scriptures interpret the earlier portions of the Scriptures? And in particular, I think this type of a reading goes back all the way, as early at least to Augustine, where Augustine says that the New Testament is hidden in the Old and revealed in the New, and that what is revealed in the Old is, what is hidden in the Old is revealed in the New, and what is revealed in the New is hidden in the Old. And so it's just the idea that you have this, mutually interpretive document, that the New Testament constitutes the infallible, inerrant, commentary on the Old. You could say the same thing, if you will, about the prophets, for example, in relationship, and say, for example, Isaiah and his relationship to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, where in Isaiah 53, the prophet is using the language of Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement, so that now he's not talking about the scapegoat carrying and bearing the sins of Israel, but rather he's talking about the suffering servant carrying and bearing the sins of the elect of Israel. And so in that sense, you find the latter portions interpreting the earlier portions. And so that's the contrast in the approach, so that you look at, say, like a more of a literal wooden hermeneutic or interpretive method, say, for example, somebody like Leon Morris, who's written his massive scientific, not Leon Morris, sorry, Morris is his last name. His first name eludes me at the moment. But Morris's commentary on the scientific commentary on the Scriptures, he presents it oftentimes a very wooden kind of literalism. Say, for example, that the reason that Adam suffered death from eating from the tree of knowledge is that it must have had some kind of poison in it. Those types of interpretations. But yet, when you look at the way the New Testament handles the opening chapters of Genesis, as I mentioned earlier in our chat, that's not the way that Paul handles the text. I think one of the most prominent examples that comes to mind, or at least a couple of examples that come to mind, is when Jesus is telling his disciples, if you can accept it, if you can believe it, John the Baptist is Elijah. Well, your dispensationalists will say, well, no, I'm waiting for literal Elijah. But yet the New Testament tells us that the way to interpret the prophecy of Elijah to come in Malachi is by listening to Jesus' words when he says that John the Baptist is Elijah to come. Or say, for example, in Acts chapter 15, where Paul and Barnabas are recounting their missionary journeys amidst the Gentiles. And he says, they say that, hey, wow, this influx of the Gentiles is what was prophesied in Amos about the rebuilding of the fallen tabernacle of David. Well, it's not that we're looking for a literal reconstruction of David's temple or the tabernacle or the Old Testament temple that David, commissioned through Solomon, but rather the temple is the people of God, and the Gentiles constitute a portion of that temple, as Paul spells out, for example, in Ephesians chapter 2, where he says that Jews and Gentiles are being formed into one man, and they are being built up into the house of the living God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. Here's that non-literal language where the New Testament itself is calling Jesus a cornerstone. He's not a physical block of stone, and he's calling the apostles foundation stones. They're not blocks of stone. Rather, they use that language metaphorically or non-literally to convey a message. So that's the big distinction that I think is so important to grasp.
So it was Henry Morris.
Henry Morris, there you go, okay.
Yeah. You make reference to him in your introduction when you discuss this issue. So that would be an interesting question, I would think, with Henry Morris, if the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if its fruit was poisonous, it sure took a long time to take effect.
Yeah, exactly. Some 900 years or so it goes
through. Right. Okay. Yeah. So I grew up in a dispensational, non-reformed background, independent fundamental Church of America, and I have made my pilgrimage out of that background. And it's been an interesting pilgrimage because if I had known I was going to change my thinking on so many different things, I would have documented my travels, because I want to look back now where I am now and think, why am I thinking this way now? What is it that happened 20 years ago? So, for instance, I graduated from Moody Bible Institute, and I remember writing a paper on the New Covenant, and I remember reading Marcellus Kick, his short book on Matthew 24 and 25. It made absolutely no difference in my life at that time, because I was so entrenched in a dispensational paradigm that I read the book, but I rejected his paradigm out of hand. And now I would hand that book out to anybody who was trying to understand the Olivet Discourse and say, you know what, read this book. It's got a really different perspective than you might be used to, but I think that it's got a better alternative than the dispensational model. But to think back in 1993 when I was reading that book, if I could go back in time and say to myself, this book is right in terms of what you're trying to do. Pay attention to it, because I didn't even, like I said, I don't even know if I used it in my paper. I'm like, this isn't, whatever. So it's so interesting to think about how God orchestrates our travels in our theological maturity. So you're from, well, you got your master's from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. So does that mean that you were once Baptist, but now you're Presbyterian in terms of your view of baptism?
Yes. I mean, overall, what happened is that I was born and initially raised in the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, PCUSA. And then my parents at the time ended up taking my brother and me to whatever churches just had strong preaching, so that took us to a number of different places. And in my older youth, that ended up taking us to a Baptist church, and that's how we ended up going to a Baptist seminary. But once I was at that Baptist seminary, I listened to a whole lot of R.C. Sproul tapes. And I don't know.
That's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah,
that's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah, but I was back with the janitor, and I listened to 3 to 4 hours of Sproul a night. And by the time I was done with seminary, I thought, I think I'm more Presbyterian than I am Baptist, and so I made the switch.
Yeah, that's so funny, because that's exactly what happened to me in the audiovisual department. I can't even tell you how I came across. Maybe it might have been just simply somebody suggesting that I read R.C. Sproul, and then I see his name in the audiovisual. But it was a a VHS tape rather than an audio tape. So
Okay.
I was shirking my undergrad responsibilities and just putting tape after tape into the player. But my only point in bringing that up was just to show that even you, in terms of transitioning from Baptist to Presbyterian, it was something that you planned on. It was something that in God's providence He had taken you through that issue, and He brought you to the other side, and now you are operating within that community that was different than where you started.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure that there are thousands and thousands of stories that are like that. Okay, so let's go into last things first. What do I want to ask you now about this? Let me ask you this, because I was actually reading it before I got on the line with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to be honest. I still don't understand what your argument is in terms of the covenant of works and Adam's responsibility. So as I thought about it for myself, I thought, okay, this is the way that I would maybe generalize about it. I detect a nuance in your approach with understanding Adam's responsibility with the covenant of works in a different way than what we would find in Westminster. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I think the question makes sense, but that wouldn't be my intention. So maybe it's a lot of clarity on my part.
Okay. Well, but like I said, that's something that I had read like 3 or 4, 5 different times, and I still come away with, I'm not really sure I understand. So, if I could generalize again about the basic flavor of Westminster and understanding the covenant of works, is that Adam failed to do something that he was supposed to do in order to produce a result. Now, you talk about that to a certain extent, but you also talk about, and what's interesting, I thought about this now that it just came to my head. Seth Postel's book, Adam as Israel, is another dynamic addition to this discussion. But what he does in there that made me think of it right now is that he says, oh, now it just left me. It just left me. Bring it back. Okay, let me go. Let me see if I can say it. What I was going to say before the Seth Postel, it comes back to my mind. Yeah. So he brings up. So if we were in a Sunday school class right now, John, and I said to the Sunday school class, how many commandments did God give Adam in the garden? I would venture to say that 99.9% they would say 1. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because it was the only sanction with consequence. But I appreciated Seth Postel's flavor when he talked about the other aspects of the garden scenario that you don't necessarily think as mandates per se, because, of course, they wouldn't have resulted in death per se, right? So if you didn't accomplish the dominion mandate, there was no sanction of death associated with that. So now that I'm thinking about what you wrote, maybe that's what you were trying to bring out in terms of talking about Adam's full responsibility in the garden, because you do talk about the dominion mandate, and then you have that little section of the misunderstood aspect of the dominion mandate. But I guess to all of this to say, what I didn't come away with was a traditional understanding of the covenant of works, which would, I think, be that Adam was supposed to win eternal life for all of us, and he failed. So maybe because you said, well, that wasn't the desired effect I was going for, maybe I wasn't reading between the lines strong enough to see that you were making those two different approaches. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the things that I wanted to convey is that very point, which is in, which is in the book. I think I just have to look it up. But the overall idea is that Christ takes up Adam's failed work, and that what Christ secures for us, which is eternal life, is the very same thing that that Adam was given. In other words, securing eternal life for us. And so that, you look at that in terms of Galatians 4:4, for example, that Christ was born under the law. And this is essentially the same law that Adam receives. And so that's the idea that I was trying to convey, and that's one of the things that I end up, I guess pointing to and saying that why is it that the Bible ends in, if I can put it this way, in Genesis-like terms. In other words, you have the earth filled with people, this image, and it's this earth-sized temple, if you will. And elsewhere, the New Testament would characterize these people as bearing the image of God, or in this case, we would say, bearing the image of Christ. And there's a particular quote that I use from N.T. Wright, and that he says that Adam takes up that Christ takes up the failed work of Adam, and he comes as a faithful one, and that's why I think, for example, my guess would be, at least at this point, that this is one of the reasons as to why the Son of Man, which comes to us from Psalm 8, and it's an appellation given to Adam, is one of Jesus's favorite, at least in terms of the number of times you find it in the Gospels referring to himself, so that it's one of his favorite terms for himself, Son of Man. And so I think it's his way of saying, hey, I'm the last Adam, or I'm the second Adam, however you want to term it. And so that's his way of saying, I've come to take up Adam's work. So yeah, no, I basically completely agree with, say what the Westminster Confession of Faith, for example, would say on that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to. I knew I should have written it down while I was listening to you, but I thought I'll remember. I can't remember the question I was going to ask you based on what you were just saying. Maybe it'll come back to me. Okay, so we are talking about the opening chapters of Genesis, and the title of your book is Unlocking Genesis. Well, the subtitle, Unlocking Genesis 1 through 3 with the Christ of Eschatology. So you would say that what we understand about eschatology is helpful for us understanding as well. And you talked about it a bit in what you just described when you alluded to Revelation. But what you're also encouraging us to do in your book is to say that the eschatological flavor of the New Testament is relevant for the opening chapters of Genesis. So I have tried in my podcast, because my primary influence in my biblical theological education has really been James Jordan, and you cite him in your book. But in the past couple of years, as I've thought through my thinking on Genesis, I've also have been influenced by John Walton and Michael Heiser, and so thinking through those different perspectives, because they're all saying different things, or they're all saying things differently. One of the things that I've tried to do in my early podcasts is, I've said this, before you even begin to read Genesis 1 through 3, you need to know something more. You need to have your thinking influenced in such a way so that you are already squinting your eyes. You are already not dubious, but you are already in a mentality of inspection. You are saying, okay, this is telling me more than what's prima facie. And some of the things that you said in your book rang true with that. For instance, I was looking through it again today, and I think it was just right there in the introduction. Let me look over real quick. It was something you referred to in Jeremiah 33. You're talking about the covenant, the nature of the covenant, and you talk about the covenant that God made with day and night. And then, so when you read Genesis 1, you don't have, thus God made a covenant with the day and the night. You don't have that until you get to Jeremiah. And then lo and behold, Jeremiah says something in such a way that you think of Genesis 1. And you pull those two things together and suggest that Jeremiah's comment about this helps us to have more information about Genesis 1. So that has been some of my approach that I've labeled my faux Christian, F-A-U-X, my faux Christian as Granny Smith and Grandpa Joe, because they are simply people who are reading the Bible just to read and just know what God has given to us. They just want to know Jesus and just read the Bible. But they actually need to know more about the book that they're reading. Otherwise, they're going to miss what you're suggesting, and that is that the eschatology of the New Testament actually has deep, deep roots in the opening chapters of Genesis 1 through 3. So if you were going to start a Sunday school class and do that, if you were going to say, like you explained in your book, that the book comes from that Sunday school class scenario, pretend you're going to be in the first Sunday school class and you say, okay, now before we read this, I think that it's important for you to understand this. What would that be?
I think that, again, it goes back to comments that I made earlier about, saying, well, we got to read the Bible just like any other book. I think that any type of genre of literature always has its unique rules of interpretation. You don't read a novel the same way that you read a newspaper article, or I should say an internet article these days, or, you don't read it the same way that you would read poetry. I think that we naturally gravitate towards those various rules for each particular genre of literature that we look at. And in this particular case, I think that when we're reading the Bible, I think we really have to have a solid knowledge of it in terms of its patterns, in terms of its language, and what have you. And I think that the common problem is that so many people come either to the Genesis narrative or say to the New Testament and read it largely kind of in an isolated fashion, maybe the way that they would click on a remote article on the internet, look at it, and then kind of wander away digitally to something else. And they kind of read it as a, kind of like a ragbag collection of things. One of the things that I try to convey to my congregation regularly, and this is what I did in my preaching, is I preached through the Pentateuch, because I said to them, the first 5 books of the Bible are so foundational to understanding the rest of Scripture, because everything else grows out of the Pentateuch. Everything that the prophets are interacting and talking about presupposes a knowledge of the Pentateuch. I think everything that goes in the Gospels presupposes the Pentateuch. Everything that goes on in Paul's letters presupposes the Pentateuch, as well as the other portions of the Scriptures, but especially the Pentateuch. And in Paul's day, I think you're dealing with people that, because they didn't have written copies of the Scriptures, probably would have had massive portions of the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, committed to memory. And because they had it committed to memory, Paul or any apostle would be able to speak to them in this scriptural context, if you will, and they would have automatically picked up on allusions and language to Old Testament stuff, especially in the Pentateuch, because they were so familiar with it. And I think that way, when if you're really familiar with the first 5 books of the Bible, then when you start reading, say, 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul starts talking about there are certain bodies that have certain types of things, and there's, heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, our minds would automatically gravitate towards Genesis 1 and 2. Or when Jesus says, hey, I'm the Son of Man, our minds would automatically gravitate to Psalm 8 and then back to Genesis 1, so that we would just be thinking in those categories. That, I think, is the interpretive rule, if you will, or the idea that I would want to convey to people is reading the Bible in its own terms. And when you do that, I think that you naturally begin to pick up and read, if you will, in stereo. And, my dad, he was a photographic interpreter for the Navy, and they used to give them stereo glasses to look at pictures, and that they would put 2 pictures side by side, stare through the stereo lenses, and all of a sudden it would bring the photograph into relief, and it would make it look 3-dimensional, even though you're looking at a 2-dimensional image. You can do that with, my kids have the viewfinder thing that with a little disc and a little pictures, the stereoscope. Well, that's the way you do that. You read the Bible in stereo, if you will, and all of a sudden that's going to, I think, provide, rather than a flat map, it's going to give us a relief map, if you will, one that has, 3-dimensional figures and enables us to read the Old Testament the way the New Testament authors read it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's an interesting metaphor to bring out. I remember the question that came to my mind earlier, something that you had said about Adam in the garden, and I wanted to ask you to flesh this out a little bit in terms of how you would say this if someone asked this in the class after it was all finished on Sunday morning. How is it that Adam was able to have Torah prior to Sinai? So something that you had said about 10 minutes ago, and then I said I had a question I couldn't remember. It was something along those lines. I wouldn't have put it that way 10 minutes ago, but that's the way it came to my mind right now. Can you talk about that a little bit in terms of how, or if you can remember even maybe back to what you said, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, it's the idea that once again, this is if you look at just the Baal Genesis narrative itself and just take it strictly in its own terms, you're going to be kind of hamstrung to try to make these types of connections. But if we recognize that God has inspired the whole and that we're dealing with the plenary inspiration of the scriptures, then that means that we can, and it's the same Spirit who inspires it all, then that means that we can use one part of it to interpret and understand the other part of it. So in that respect, if you look at historic formulations, say, of the covenant of works, or say look at the original proof texts for the covenant of works in Westminster Confession, chapter 7, paragraph 2, or Westminster Confession, chapter 19, paragraphs 1 and 2, it talks about, they cite there Romans 2:14 and 15 as one of the proof texts, where the Apostle Paul in Romans talks about the works of the law being written upon the hearts of people, in particular Gentiles. And he says there in Romans 2 within context that the Jews, he says, they have Torah. They have the law revealed at Sinai and inscribed upon the tablets of stone. But how is it that God holds Gentiles accountable to his law? Well, they have the work of the law written on their heart, and indeed all of us have the work of the law written on our heart. And so this is why the Westminster Divine cites the Romans 2:14 and 15 passage there in the original edition. I don't recall what I think it's probably there in later editions, say in 20th and 21st century editions of the Westminster Standards as well. But it's the idea, and it was James Ussher, who was the Archbishop of the Church in Ireland in the 17th century, who coined this phrase or used this phrase. He says, when God gave to Adam the command not to consume from the tree of knowledge, he whispered the content of the moral law into his ear. Now that's a bit of a stretch in the sense that I don't think he meant that literally, but rather he meant to say it that by virtue of the law inscribed upon his heart, that in a sense the command, the forbidding him from eating from the tree encapsulated, and if you will, was related to and a part of the moral law. And so this is why, for example, the Westminster Confession of Faith in chapter 19, paragraph 1 says that God gave to Adam the moral law as a covenant of works. And then where is the moral law summarily comprehended? But it's summarily comprehended in the Decalogue or in the Ten Commandments. So that that's the connection that you see there. And you have the, that is the moral standard, if you will, of the covenant of works. So this is how he knows of the law, not only through the positive command, don't eat from the tree, as well as be fruitful, fill the earth, subdue it, and multiply, but also in terms of the law inscribed upon his heart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now that you say it that way. I understand exactly what you're talking about. You're basically what you're saying is that in humanity's ontology, in their metaphysical composition, there is an innate understanding of God's character and law, and the Torah is simply that reality put in writing, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's
Would
right.
that make? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I appreciate that. So when I just had almost a hiccup in my mind as I was listening to you and thought, okay, well, what about this? But I understand exactly what you're saying. One of the things that I thought of in the introduction, as you were talking about two different approaches, well, actually, I don't think you talked about the second approach. I just drew an inference. The one approach that looks at Genesis 1, 2, and 3 from a scientific perspective, what we call creation science, that the account of creation is a record of what happened scientifically. and you go through a very good discussion of the literalist hermeneutic of Henry Morris and others who say, well, obviously if Adam died from eating the fruit, then it must have been poisoned or whatever, you know. And you talk about that nuance. You talk about there are certain results that I don't think you necessarily want to have if you approach it from this perspective. So that if you look at the text from a literal, this is teaching me a scientific reality, you have a consequence that you might not necessarily have thought through or be happy with. So there's one approach. Go ahead.
No, yeah, go ahead. I mean, I was just going to say that I think I quoted in the book that I think it's Hugh Ross who says that the Genesis 1 through 11 account reads like a modern scientific report. And I think, oh goodness, no, there are oceans of philosophical and scientific differences between this 15th century BC document and, of 20th and now 21st century scientific report. They're coming at the subject very, very differently. Right.
Yeah. So I think then one of the things that I thought of as a result of you discussing creation science, and that is that I would say that there is the creation science approach is a concordist approach. That is that we want to see the scriptures and the scientific interpretation of the world around us in accord. We want to see them harmonious. So that's the approach of the creation science, is that we know that God has revealed himself in nature. We know God has revealed himself in his word, and never the twain shall conflict, so they have to be harmonious. So that's the approach from that perspective. I think that the other alternative is best represented by someone right now, Pete Enns, to a certain extent, who represents in my mind an accommodationist perspective. And that is, Pete Enns will say, well, no, this isn't teaching us about science. What it's actually, and this is being completely curt because I disagree with him, but he says, basically this is telling us that these people had no idea what they were talking about, and they did the best they could, and God said simply, okay, that was the best you could do, I'll work with it. Right? So when you see in day two that God put up a rakia, well, no, he didn't. No, he didn't. Because obviously it's not a solid dome. Obviously it's not a hammered out piece of metal. So what does someone like Pete Enns do? He says, well, that's what they thought. Right? Yeah. So in my mind, there are two presentations to us. That is, we can either go completely literal or we can go completely ignorant. And the way that I would like to say it is that, no, I think actually those two solutions are non sequiturs. That is, they don't follow if we understand that Genesis 1, 2, and 3 to begin with are intentionally eschatological. So that if we understand the information that we're given has to do with where God is moving history, then that informs us about how we're supposed to process the information. And I felt like a lot of what you brought in terms of a healthy understanding of typology related to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I try to tell my students is that, if you look at Book of Revelation, for example, it's not a book that you read literalistically, unless, of course, you have that conviction, obviously, then you would read it that way, but that you don't read it literalistically, but rather, I like to say the Book of Revelation, requires, it's kind of like the PhD in Old Testament studies, because it is so chock full of Old Testament imagery. One of the simplest ways that you can study the Book of Revelation is if you see a mountain, or you see frog, or you see, a scorpion, whatever it may be that appears in there, just get a concordance or, computer Bible, whatever, and search all the places in the Old Testament where that particular word is mentioned and see how the Old Testament uses it. And so that's one of the reasons why I tell my students that you really have to know your Old Testament before you can really, I think, approach the Book of Revelation. That being said, the book of Revelation, therefore, is written in that Old Testament prophetic idiom and that Old Testament imagery. I think that shows, or it forecasts, if you will, or it gives us the end of the story. Well, I think the book of Genesis in those opening chapters is very much, I think, written in that type of style. Not exclusively, but I think that it bears those fingerprints all over it, so that, it's I don't know, the way I like to say it, it's a squinty image that, you're squinting and you can see these things kind of drawn in rough hewn lines, so that when Genesis tells us, it looks into the distant past to tell us that God created, it doesn't necessarily tell us how God created. We don't know how many metric tons of carbon he used. We don't know what the speed of light was. We don't know. There's so many unanswered questions. And in that respect, I think ancient Jewish interpretation of the creation narrative, they always look to Job, I think, in Job chapters 38 and following, when they wanted to address questions of how God created, and it ultimately ended up with hands clasped over mouths, because they basically recognized with Job that God has not revealed a lot of these things. And so I think that's why it's a mistaken approach to go, to Genesis with that scientific literalistic approach. But conversely, like you said, I think it's also a mistake to assume that the ancient Israelites were rubes, that they were theological dolts. I want to say they knew where babies came from too. They weren't idiots. And I think that you look at modern man, for example, or maybe we need to say postmodern man these days. We are just as superstitious as the ancient Israelites were. And
yeah,
we have
sure, right.
as many idols as they do, and we use as much non-literalistic language and allegorical language in all of the things that we talk about. It's like reading a weather report from the 21st century when we say sunrise is at 6:36. And I think, oh, what idiots! I can't believe they still thought the sun was, was moving around the Earth rather than the Earth moving around the sun. And so that's why I want to say that I'm not convinced of the end approach either, saying that obviously they believe it was a hard surface dome. So I think the answer lies somewhere in between, which, as I've said throughout our time chatting here, that is, well, how does the Bible interpret it? How does the New Testament handle it? How does the prophets handle it? So I think that's I find myself agreeing with you there. Yeah.
Well, let me throw something at you that I'm sure give you pause to agree with me, at least initially. But I'd like you to think about it because I find it very interesting. The last verse in the book of Daniel, we are told that Daniel is to lie down and sleep with his fathers, but he will stand up again at the end of days. And you've talked about the importance of the uniformity of Scripture and studying out words that we might find if we wanted to understand what was meant by this. I think that we are compelled to consider, where does Daniel get this phrase, the end of days? Let me tell you, if I was going to give a New Living Translation or a New Message Bible, so to speak, this is how I would end the book of Daniel. Daniel, go your way. You will lie down, but you will stand up again at the end of the week. And what I mean by that is that I am strongly persuaded that Genesis 1 is eschatological and is the basis for our understanding of the latter days and the trajectory of history. So that, as you alluded to in Galatians 4 earlier, when Paul says that in the fullness of time, Christ was born under the law. That fullness of time, I would also say, to a certain extent, I could say, how about this? At the end of the week, Christ was born. So that Genesis 1 is a picture of the Heilsgeschichte. It's a picture of the story of redemption, so that the first 6 days are the history of Torah. And then the seventh day is the kingdom. It is the Sabbath rest. It is that which Christ brings. So in terms of what we're talking about, I think that, we you and Jordan and others who are comfortable with a typological explanation of Genesis 1, I think I'm pushing it a little bit further, and I'm wanting to say, again, if at the end of the class, if I taught a first 1 week of class on Genesis 1, and somebody said at the end, so do you think that the days were actual 24-hour days? I would say that's not what Genesis 1 is about. That's not what it's concerned with. And someone else raises their hand and says, well, do you think, light traveled at the same speed? And I would say the same thing. That is not what this text is about. Those questions don't follow. So stop asking them.
Yeah, no, I mean, it generally it resonates with me. I'd have to give it some thought, and you always want to make sure that while I myself am a typological maximalist, at the same time, I don't want to over maximize my reading of the scriptures and make sure that I'm staying within the guardrails that scripture itself sets up. But I think there's a lot to what you're saying that definitely rings true, and I think that's the in terms of looking at the overall picture as a week and entering into the seventh day rest of God. I think that's generally, I think, biblically sound, and I think it's a good way to look at things. And with respect to the second issue that you raised, it also resonates with me as well, that there are certainly some things that where you find scripture and science overlapping, and while the Bible may not be particularly interested in addressing scientific issues, it nevertheless, impacts our understanding and our reading of the book of nature. So that, for example, if we say that God created out of nothing, well, then to say that, as Stephen Hawking does, that maybe everything that is has always been, and that matter is eternal. And I guess as Aristotle also once, I think, opined that we would say, okay, there's a conflict between the claims of unbelieving scientists or philosophers and what the scriptures say. So there are some overlapping issues there. But at the same time, we don't want to press the Bible into the service of answering questions that the Bible was itself never designed or intended to answer. It's like when the Westminster Divines wrote the Westminster Standards. They say, what do the scriptures principally teach? Well, the scriptures principally teach are, what we are, our duties to God and what we are, what things we're to believe about God and our duties towards Him. It draws a very narrow focus upon what the scriptures are about. And there are a number of statements that I've read over the years by Westminster Divines that would say that the Bible doesn't teach us about language. It doesn't teach us science. It doesn't teach us about astronomy. And that's why, say in the words of the Belgic Confession, God has given us two books. That's the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And so that we can, recognize that the book of nature talks about and addresses certain subjects, whereas the book of Scripture talks about and addresses other subjects. And if we try to press one book into addressing subjects that it does not speak to, then we inevitably create problems. So if we try to press the book of nature into teaching us about Christ and salvation, we're going to have problems because it doesn't address that subject. And conversely, if we try to press the book of Scripture, which is primarily about God's revelation in Christ and the salvation that comes through Him, into addressing scientific matters such as, say, the speed of light, then we're going to run into problems. We end up endorsing perhaps bad interpretations of the Scripture and pushing them onto scientific explanations and creating problems where there need not be problems.
Mm-hmm. One of the last things I want to try to just bring up briefly, if I may, is something that I would say in Genesis chapter 2 is a non sequitur as I'm approaching the text as well, and that is that I wouldn't say that Genesis 2 and 3 show us how Adam failed. So that had he not failed, things would have turned out differently. I don't think that if we approach the text from an eschatological perspective, that question follows, because that in a sense gives us an explanation for the incarnation apart from what we call original sin, per se, or the original, the fall. Because in the traditional sense, Christ only became incarnate to take care of sin. Mm-hmm. However, I think that we need to rethink the incarnation as the result of the history that God began in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So that the incarnation was always the telos, so to speak. Christ was always going to become incarnate. But he doesn't become incarnate to make up for the deficiency of Adam, per se. Rather, in what Paul says, when I was a child, I thought as a child, but now that I'm grown up, I have put away childish things. And in my opinion, he was talking about the Torah. The Torah was childish. The Torah was rules upon rules upon rules for children. But the maturity of history has moved so that Christ has culminated history so that we are all adults. We are all mature in Christ, so that we then think of history from Genesis 1 on as the yellow brick road. So that Torah, keeping and guarding and observing Torah, is to be thought of as walking along that yellow brick road. So that when you get to the end of that yellow brick road, as Paul says in the fullness of time, you are more than prepared to understand exactly what you're doing as you cross the threshold into the kingdom of God, which is what the wicked apostates were not willing to do in Jesus' generation. Now, you had Nicodemus, who came by night and whatnot and converts, and you have Peter and all of the apostles that convert, and you have mass conversions at Pentecost, yes. But the Pharisees, the Sauls, who had idolized Torah and wanted to stay in the past and refused to move into the future, I think that I'm more comfortable talking about that aspect of who Adam is and what he represents. So that Adam didn't fail, per se, any more than Israel failed based on what Moses said in Deuteronomy 32. Moses begins to sing a song, and his basic song is, you guys are going to blow chunks. You guys are going to tick God off and anger God and provoke God with all of your idolatries. But that's where I would see is the correspondence between Genesis and Deuteronomy. I would want to say that what Deuteronomy 32 portrays is what Genesis 2 and 3 portray. So that Adam doesn't fail, as if he could actually bring the eschaton right then and there when he passes his probation. The probation period that you mentioned in your book and the probation period that we talk about was the entire history of Torah. So that when that probation period was over, when that priestly era was over, you were supposed to eschew and jettison that which was a training manual for the fullness of time at the end of the age. What kinds of thoughts does that bring to your mind?
Yeah, I don't know. I've always, I kind of think of myself as, I don't know, this is just something, the first thought that comes to mind is a concrete theologian. And in that respect, I've never been attracted to, the superlapsarian Christology just because it operates and, rests on so many, I don't know, assumptions, what if, so many what ifs, right, that it's difficult to come to any solid conclusions. And so I've always felt much more comfortable saying, well, those are interesting questions, but in the end, I can't say one way or the other what might have been. So the only thing I can say is concretely is what is, and so as far as what is the infralapsarian Christology, if you will, that we have. So that's what, I typically end up dealing with. And I know that, the superlapsarian Christology's got some theologians over the years that, some big names attached to it. I think you could even put Calvin in that category. But at the same time, I've just always thought, well, I don't know, it's kind of above my pay grade, so I can't say that I have much more than that.
Yeah. What's interesting is I explained my view to another person, and he said, well, that pretty much destroys the interlapsarian, superlapsarian argument, which I had already concluded. That I thought, yeah, you know what? Because that's a non sequitur. Because the question that we ask when we teach what we teach about who God is and who man is, the logical question is, well, didn't God know that Adam was going to do that? Didn't he know? And then you have all of these theodicies that pop up because we want to excuse God from any responsibility or culpability in terms of the presence of sin. And again, right, so my approach that I'm suggesting completely has nothing to do with infralapsarian and superlapsarian in the realm of and under the paradigm of Torah. So from my perspective, Genesis 1 all the way through Revelation deals with what God did in history through Torah. And when that history came to a close, Torah died and was resurrected in Christ. And that new creation resulted, so that everything that we see from Genesis to Revelation is one unified story that makes unified sense when we understand that it's talking about this. Well, what about this? Well, but no. You don't get to ask where Cain got his wife, because that's not the point of the story. That's not the point of the story. That question doesn't follow if you approach it from this perspective. But we keep going on and on and on and on and on and talking about so many good things. But let me wrap up, because I know you only gave me a little bit of time to talk with you. Thanks again for writing your book, because I really did appreciate so much that was in it. It was very thought-provoking and very helpful in the discussion of what we're talking about in terms of biblical theology and systematics. Thanks so much for the time that you gave me today. And I hope that all
Thanks
things...
for the interest.
All right. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you for listening, really, in all honesty. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say. You know about it. RethinkingRevelation.com, Facebook, Twitter, Rethinking Revelation, yada, yada, yada. Until next time.